but through the help of hospice had come back. And they had spent several months together. He had prepared Thanksgiving for them. They had planted a garden together. He'd met his grandchildren, and one of them was at the end of the bed giggling at this moment. And in that time, I began to see not this monster, but a man who had made peace in his world, who had accomplished in these last few months more than he had accomplished in the whole rest of his life. He was not afraid, he was calm. So that really makes you think, like, what is a good death? This would not be anybody's picture of a good death at first glance. So I think a good death is not about that picture. It's about having information available to you. It's about having options, support, services, and mostly having people respect whatever that person's wishes are. I also went into another room with a woman, and her house was so dark and cold. There were no lights on. All the furniture was very stiff. The thermostat was, I guess, off. It was freezing in there. And you walk in, and your first thought was, turn on the lights, let's turn up the heat, let's get some pillows in here, this is awful. Well, it turned out she'd grown up all her life in Siberia, and this was her comfort zone. And the nurses really respected that. They'd go in and turn on a tiny little light to examine her, and they'd turn it off. But that was her comfort zone, not mine, not yours, but that was hers. I also, in the ICU, met a man who was hooked to a lot of stuff and getting a lot of treatments. And he was loving it. I mean, he'd been alone all his life. And to be in the ICU and have all these nurses, and he wanted all the treatment, this was what he wanted. So everybody's going to have their own wishes. And I realized very early in this game, I couldn't come to this with my vision of a good death. The good death is the one that follows the patient's wishes and the family's wishes. Also, I discovered that what makes a death good, quote unquote, is not necessarily a big thing. It's not necessarily that you took somebody out of a hospital. Sometimes it's the little things that happen. And I'll tell you another quick story. I was speaking to somebody whose mother very clearly and repeatedly did not want to be on any kind of life support or machines. She did not ever want a feeding tube. She was very clear with her children. And for a lot of reasons I won't go into, she ended up in the hospital on a feeding tube, on a respirator, and hooked to a lot of machines. And it was really everything she would never have wanted. And I was having a talk with her daughter, and as we talked, she said to me, you know, what I really regret most isn't that we made these decisions and she ended up on all these machines. What I regret most is that we sat in her room and we just stared at her waiting. Why didn't we pour a gin and tonic and get out some photo albums and talk about old times? So I think for me, the best part of writing this book was people saying, I called him, I wouldn't have done that. I held his hand. I did maybe some small gesture that made this easier for him, for me. So I don't want to set the bar up here at some ridiculous place. There's all sorts of ways to make a death better, and I think we have to accept that it's not always our image of what it is. Okay, so anyways, I hope everyone in this room, under the heading of what do you do, has a living will and a healthcare proxy, a medical power of attorney, giving somebody the authority to make medical decisions on your behalf. I'm going to assume everyone here has that, but if you don't, get one. Make sure that anyone you care about at all has one. Everyone should have some documents in place, and I don't personally, having studied this, care so much about specific checklists of, okay, if I have this disease and I'm in this condition, I want these medications, because I don't personally believe any of us could possibly imagine all the scenarios and all the possible treatments and outline in this healthy state what we would want in this unhealthy state. But I think you have to have the document there. Most important is the power of attorney, giving somebody this authority to make decisions. Maybe more important is just a little written note, like what you would say to somebody at that moment making those decisions, like you're their voice over their your voice over their shoulder. But anything you can give somebody, and that you have papers that your doctor has, that they have, that there's copies, that people can find them. You'd be amazed how many people have these documents, but nobody knows about them, so they don't do a lot of good. But that is just a start, and that's the point of my book, because that is only a start. And if that's all you have, then forget it. Because it's not an insurance. It's such a false sense of security. Oh, I have my documents. I'm okay. I don't need to do anything else. I really believe that we need to spend a little time really confronting what we're afraid of. You know, we all wake up at 3 a.m. with a headache and convinced it's a brain tumor and start sweating. You know, what is so frightening about our death, the death of people we love? Because I've asked people this question a lot, and it's always amazing to me that it's always something different. People fear leaving the party, things are going to go on without them. They fear pain, they fear being alone. They fear being buried alive. They fear being cold. They fear, you know, a million things that you wouldn't expect. So, you know, what is it we really fear? You know, pull this stuff out of the closet. Take a good look at it. And I know there's a lot of medical people in this room, and it's an important thing for you to do as well, because I think often you go into medicine because those fears and that dislike of death is so big. And then the next thing would be to learn about this, at least a little bit, because it's gotten very complicated. What death looks like, what are some of the common choices, possibilities, DNR, life support, hospice. Example, artificial nutrition and hydration. This is often, you know, people will say, well, I was going to pull the plug when she was there, but I'm not going to stop feeding her. We need to understand what these treatments are. Forcing nutrition into somebody at the end of life, this is not a warm cup of chicken soup. Hydration, the same. It's not a cool sip of water. This is a invasive medical procedure. Bodies have a very natural way of dying. They've done it for a long time. They know what they're doing, and they shut down. All the organs start to shut down. There's natural pain relievers that are released. To force fluids and nutrition into somebody at that state is actually creating more symptoms and more problems. We equate it in some way with, you know, basic human needs, but it's actually not a good thing at the end of life. So knowing some of this in advance will help make those decisions later, because it's very hard to learn it at that time. And also, I would say under learning about this, for me personally, and I think for everyone, you know, learning not just the medical side of this or the technical side, but, you know, how are you going to interact with somebody? How do you laugh with somebody? How do you talk to somebody at this point? I mean, everyone walks into the room of a person who's incredibly sick and stands there kind of frozen at the door, or, you know, comes in a big group and leaves in a big group. Or I can't tell you how many times I've heard patients sort of try to open the door. They'll say, I'm afraid. And the family member goes, oh, there's nothing, you're fine, don't worry about it, there's nothing to be afraid of. You know, how are we gonna talk to somebody at this time? If you really want to learn about death, go volunteer with hospice, because there's no better place to learn about it. But it's so sad that we as a culture and that we as individuals know so little about such an incredibly important thing that's going to happen to all of us and everyone we love, and we don't know how to deal with it. We don't know any of the details. And obviously, most important, talk, talk, talk. That's the title of the book. That's what I want to get people doing. Talk to your healthcare proxy. Talk, if you are a healthcare proxy, talk to your family members, talk to the doctor. Get this conversation out there. The sooner people have this conversation, the better. It's a very difficult conversation to have. It can take many attempts to have it. It's much easier when it's just a, well, what if, and what do you think? want to go through a few ways of how you would start such